I love history, especially ancient history, especially history that relates to the Bible. And I've been doing a lot of reading about ancient Persia and Greece and Babylon because of the Daniel Bible study we're doing. But one of the most interesting figures to me is Alexander the Great. I actually did a paper on him in high school, and ever since then, I've been just very interested in his life. And just what a wonder. Not only was he one of the first people to keep the coalition that his father, Philip of Macedon, had built in making the Greek states come together to fight, but then he took that army and defeated the fiercest army at the time, the Persians, and then didn't stop there, but he kept going. He made it all the way to the Indian Sea. Just an amazing thing. And not just defeating and conquering, but doing so quickly and spreading Greek culture as he went. And at some point, I'm sure that there were people all around the world wondering, well, he took care of Persia, he took care of Egypt. What will finally kill this great general? And the answer was alcohol. As he was coming back, he was in Babylon and had a big party and died at the age of 32 of alcohol poisoning. And the Bible has much to say about alcohol. I want to look at alcohol and what the Bible says about it. And this is part 2 of a 3-part series. I wondered if it would go to 4, and it will not. Okay, so next week's might be really long. No, I'm just kidding. Part 1 was I think, clear admonition to avoid drunkenness. To start with, so where do we go? Clearly, the Bible says, be not drunk with wine, that we should avoid drunkenness. Part 2, then, is the one we'll look at tonight, the examination of alcohol as a beverage in the Bible. And then next week, Lord willing, part 3 will be alcohol in the context of Christianity. So, looking at this tonight, why is it so important to talk about what we're going to talk about tonight? Because I'm not going to have you turn to a lot of different places here tonight. If you'd like to go to Hosea chapter 4, I'll just look at one verse there, and then we'll be off to Proverbs. But it might take you a while to find Hosea, so you're welcome to, to hunt that down. But why is it important to talk about what we're going to talk about tonight? The importance of words and the spectrum of thought on this topic. I think what I'm going to talk about is the word wine found in the Bible. And it's important to understand that when we have a word, that often that word has many different kinds of meanings, right? For instance, if I say, like we talked about in Sunday school, the word heart, especially in the Bible, has a lot of different meanings. Is the heart where you think? Where you feel, your conscience? Is it the real you? Is it the good you? Or is it the sinful you? And the answer is yes. The word heart means all those things. What about the word world? Right? Does the world generally have a good connotation or a bad connotation? Well, both. Sometimes it means the planet. Sometimes it means the system of thought governed by Satan. Sometimes it just means all the people in the world. And so it's important to understand that words have a varying degrees of meaning. What about the word heavens? Could mean the sky. Could just mean the expanse of the clouds. It could mean heaven where God is. And context will help you. How about love? There are a lot of different versions of love. A lot of different people that it said, loved so-and-so, but then you find out through their actions that what they were calling love wasn't really love, or real love, like what Jacob had with Rachel. So understand, I don't want to make it seem like I'm playing games with words. In fact, that's a lot of the source material that I have for this study did just that. They played around with the words. And so I just want to be really honest about the complexity of the words and the subjects that are here. And I want to try to get to the heart of it. It's important to understand which wine we're talking about. Because in every passage, it might be talking about something that's different. It might be talking about a wine that's different from what we think of, even today. So we're talking about we're talking about alcohol, which would, again, if used to excess, would make us drunk. So the question is, what does the Bible actually say then about alcohol and the use of alcohol in the Bible? So let me tell you that there are, now in the Greek, there's really only one word for wine. So I want to focus a lot of my attention, especially because the Bible talks about this in the context of the Old Testament. I'll refer more to the New Testament references next week, because even if I could convince you that alcohol, that God wanted the Jewish people to drink alcohol, you could turn around and say, yes, but we're Christians. So next week we're going to talk about alcohol in the context of Christianity. But I think there's some important things we can learn from the Old Testament before we just dismiss it, okay? Now there are at least 4 words, really 4 most used words that are translated wine or talk about alcohol in the Old Testament. And I don't know Hebrew at all. I never took Hebrew in college, and so I don't know. I couldn't give you a lot of information except what I've been told on these things. But the first one is the word yayin. And it's found 140 times in the Old Testament. And almost always, with just very few exceptions, it's translated wine. So yayin is the major one. The exception is, it's translated vine tree in Numbers chapter 6, verse 4, and it's translated banqueting in Song of Solomon 2, verse 4. There's a wide variety of uses, but it is mostly a grape product that may or may not have been alcoholic. Okay, and I'll kind of bear that out a little bit, but there's this idea that the word wine, whenever they talked about some grape product, they would have used the word yayin, and that is translated wine. The word yayin actually means up. It means to boil up or to be in ferment. So the idea was that it was this grape product, and whether you wanted to or not, grape product will start to ferment almost immediately. Okay, so there's the idea of that word, yayin. Then we have, and that's a catch-all phrase, then we have the word tirash. And tirash is translated, it's found 38 times in the Old Testament, and it is always translated wine. Now, almost every single time, with just a few exceptions, it's always found with the words corn and or oil. So when it talks about the blessings, when you go into a land and it's full of productivity, it's full of tirash and corn and oil. Okay, so again, in that sense, it's used almost like an industry word. Tirash is more of the wine that comes from, you could say vineyards, or you could say the wine industry or the grape industry. So it had this idea of as a product. Most of the time, again, it was a reference to plenty or bounty. Now, this is an interesting thing because, again, since Hebrew is such a poor language and since it's so difficult to understand, I'll give you both of what I found and make things really unhelpful. Some people say that the word tirash means expulsion. So it means any of the grape juice that is freshly expelled from the grape. So it would be freshly squeezed grape juice. That's what tirash means. And again, we'll talk about this later, but if you know how grape juice and wine are made, then it would make sense that you'd make that connotation with something that's freshly squeezed with wine. But then other people say it actually means take possession of. The word tirash means to take possession of because it's definitely talking about an intoxicating beverage that takes possession of your mind. So now can you understand how, again, if we're talking about wine, we're talking about freshly squeezed grape juice, you could say, this is tirash. I just got it from the grapes and boy, is it good. Or you could be saying, this is tirash, and I'm going to turn it into tirash. I'm going to turn it into wine, right? So this is, when the grape juice comes out, somebody who's going to make it into wine says, oh, this is tirash. It's something that I'm going to use to make wine. And in both of those senses, the word could be used. The third word is only found 5 times in the Bible, and it's the word asis, and it's translated sweet wine, new wine, and in Song of Solomon 8, verse 2, the spiced wine of the juice of the pomegranate. The word juice there. So it's something that is to denote new grape juice, like new wine, or something that's just been taken out of the grapes. And then the last word is the word shakar. And the word shakar means specifically something to intoxicate. It's close to the word shakar, which means drunk. 23 times in the Old Testament, the word shakar is translated strong drink or strong wine or even drunkards. This was specifically something to make you drunk. Now, probably it was a drink made from a non-grape source, which would have been pomegranate, dates, or apples. The Babylonians and the Assyrians loved date wine. People in Israel drank grape wine. But shakar was definitely something that was intoxicating. Okay, so let me just review. Yayin was a catch-all, any kind of grape product. Tirash possibly meant something that was fresh, but it meant more like the abundance of the grape juice product. Isis means something that was brand new, like juice. There's definitely a word for that. And then shakar means something that was made to intoxicate. Now, what do these different words teach us? It teaches us that not all wine was alcoholic, but much of it was. Much of it had some kind of alcoholic content. Not all wine was fresh grape juice. Some was fermented. And let me just say, I wish that I could cut up here and say, oh, no, don't you understand that every time you see this word, it was just talking about grape juice. But I want to be honest with you, and that's just not the case. When you look at the word and how it's used, most of the time, it's referring to something that had the potential, at least, for intoxication. Therefore, some alcoholic wine, in some sense, was used by God's people in the Old Testament on a pretty regular basis. Now, Hosea chapter 4, verse 11, Verse 10 says, "For they shall eat and not have enough. They shall commit whoredom and shall not increase, because they have left off to take heed to the Lord. Whoredom and wine and new wine take away the heart." So we could say this: whoredom and yayin and tirash take away the heart. So the idea, again, is that those two things in the minds of the Lord, in the mind of Hosea, were two distinct things. This idea of wine and this tirash, which was new wine or juice. Again, unless that other understanding was, or that other definition is in there. Both are said, though, to take away the heart. Why? We're not sure exactly. Perhaps it was this ease of life and the indulgence in drinking, that people that are just seeking, again, if tirash means this abundance, then it's people that are, like in Proverbs it says, don't seek after oil. People that love oil and wine are going to come to poverty because it's you love the finer things in life and not just what normal people drink. But wine was definitely something that was more abundant and more expensive. So how was wine made? Well, they would gather the grapes and they would put them in a vat. And as they put all the grapes in a vat, some of the juice would actually start to come out just from the weight of the grapes. And that was the very best stuff. So they would bottle that before they ever put any weight on the grapes. And just having it in there would produce this sweet grape juice. And they would bottle that, and they would actually set that aside to be used for grape juice. It was called the sweet wine. Then they would put pressure on the vats. And I'm not going to give you a lot of detail about all of this, but they generally had 3 different compartments or vats, and they would have these weights that they would put onto these vats, and then they would have these spouts, and the grape juice would come out of those spouts. And so that was where they got most of the wine. So they put the first stuff away, that was the sweet wine, and then they pressed it down, and that was what became yayin. And then they would actually, after they got just about everything they could out, they would add water to the mixture, and they would take all of that out so that what was left would be a water and the pulp or the peels mixture. And they would take that and they would let that ferment, and that's generally what they would use for vinegar, right? It was already kind of bitter. It wasn't, you weren't going to use it for a lot of things except just vinegar. That was whenever you see wine settled on the lees, that pulp, that mash was called the lees. Okay, so then they would take this yayin, this juice, and they would start to ferment it. Now, grape juice, I'm told, easily ferments. So they would put it into a jar or a vat and let it start to ferment. If they put it in a closed container right away, it would start to ferment. Just the yeast in the air would start to ferment it, and it would actually explode the wineskins. And so they would put it in this vat, and after a week, then they would put it into some pretty strong wineskins. Now, when you read about a wineskin or a wine bottle in the Bible, a bottle, we think of glass bottles, right? But it was really, and this is a picture I've seen, imagine taking a goat and taking the head off of the goat, and then taking the skin off of that goat, and taking the hair off of that goat, so it's leather, and then sewing that goat right back up. So you had kind of the body, and then a leg, right? And or maybe two legs in the front, 2 legs in the back. That was a wine bottle. That's what you put your water in, that's what you put your wine in, and that's what it was. So if it had been there for a while, then, if it had wine in it for a while, this goat filled with wine, and if it was new, then it could probably expand with the wine. If it was old, then it's kind of met the max of its stretching. So if you put that new wine into that old bottle, what would happen? Well, it would burst, right? So that's why Jesus said what he said. But that's what they would do. And they would leave it in there in a cool place. And after 40 days, then after that fermentation process, then it was considered wine. And it could be offered in an offering. Then after that, it was moved into other containers for storage, really only for a year. The Jewish people could only store that for a year before it turned to vinegar. And it wasn't good grape juice anymore. It was really sour and pungent. So what would change in this fermentation process? What it was doing, it was changing the sugar to ethanol. So it would take the yeast that was in the air, and it would interact with the sugar, and that would make ethanol, or that product. Now, it doesn't have to be that way, right, Amy? So we got a grapevine years ago, and we built a trellis, and it was going up, and it just never did anything. And we're like, all right, cut it down, it cumbereth the ground. Kidding, we didn't do anything else with it. We just cut it down, got rid of the trellis and everything. And Lydia's out there in the backyard this year, and she looks, and that little grapevine went into our lilac bushes, and it was just everywhere. And I've got pictures. She's got boxes of all these grapes. And so we brought them in, right? Maybe just one. You're looking at me like I'm making this up, but this really happened. I have pictures. So they took it, and they brought it inside, and they had boiling water, and they put grapes in the bottom, and I think some sugar, and we made wine. No, we made grape juice, right? And I don't know, again, I just don't know anything about this, but it takes apparently a lot of yeast to make it really ferment and turn all of because the sugar has to have enough, the yeast has to have enough sugar to feed on. So you have to add sugar, and you have to add a lot of yeast, and that's what's going to convert it to ethanol. And if you don't have enough, then it'll just be grape juice. So again, when you think about yayin, it could be grape juice, or it could be something that was fermented. If you added the yeast to it and the conditions were right, then you could turn it into something alcoholic. Now, sometimes they would take that juice, that yayin, and they would boil it until all the moisture went down, and it became kind of this jelly paste. And then that was a lot easier to store for them. So they would maybe put it in the jar, this jelly, and it was kind of a sealed tight jar. But if they needed some grape juice, or if they needed some yayin in some way, they would just kind of take that, and it would be like Kool-Aid, except it wasn't powdered. They would just have kind of a spoonful of this, and they'd put it in water, and they'd mix it up, and then you'd have some good tasting grape juice out of this. And again, that was called yayin as well. Now, sometimes it would ferment, and sometimes it would become alcoholic. And so, if you wanted to get buzzed, you'd put some of that in a cup and then just kind of mix it up, and then you'd have something that was pretty pungent. But if you just wanted grape juice, well, you just add more water, and then it was something that you could drink, and it was like grape juice then. Often, again, they would dilute this wine with water. So it wasn't just a straight, even if you had something that had alcohol in it, they would take that and they would dilute it a little bit. And over in Proverbs chapter 9, if you've ever seen this before, this is what this means. So in Proverbs 9, this is the picture of wisdom as a woman who is trying to get the simple that are passing by her house into her house to feast at the table of wisdom. And so verse 1 says, wisdom hath builded her house. She hath hewn out her 7 pillars. She hath killed her beasts. She hath mingled her wine. She hath also furnished her tables. What does that mean, mingled her wine? Well, I mean, she took the wine and she prepared it. She watered it down. She might have added some herbs or maybe some honey to it, but she was preparing it. She didn't just have the wine and here you go. She actually mingled it. She had to water it down a little bit so it was something that was easier to consume. Some scholars, and again, this is all over the board. Some scholars said that the wine was a 1-to-2 ratio. So for every one, like if you had some liquid wine, you'd put that in there and then you'd put 2 parts water in. And that's how you do it. Other people said, no, it's more like 1-to-3. And other people said it was 1-to-4, especially in New Testament times. In New Testament times, the Jewish people especially were mixing their wine 1-to-4. Only the heathen, only the barbarian were drinking close to straight wine. Hastings, in his dictionary, said this: it may be stated at this point that no trace can be found among the hundreds of references to the preparation and use of wine in the Mishnah of any means employed to preserve wine in the unfermented state. It is even improbable that with the means at their disposal, the Jews could have so preserved it had they wished. So it was again, really what it was about was preservation. How do we get this to stay? It was going to naturally ferment, or it was going to spoil, and if you didn't do something with it, then all that work in your vineyard was going to be for nothing. And so you had to understand that there was going to be a fermentation process. You had to understand that there was going to be some chemical reactions, and you had to do something about that. Okay, so with all that said, let's now talk about the spectrum of alcoholic content. Okay, so what we're talking about, so when we're asking the question, what did they drink, and was it okay for them to drink alcohol, what we're asking is, what's the spectrum of alcoholic drinks? Why is it important to talk about the spectrum of alcohol? Well, because if the Bible says that wine is okay, then it's okay. We should probably know what the Bible means by that, right? Because if the Bible's saying you can have something that's just above grape juice, we should know that. If the Bible's saying go ahead and guzzle Everclear, we should probably know that too, right? That'd be kind of important to know. We want to know how to transfer what they had to today. And what's the real problem with wine? Not that it's made from grapes, but that there's a certain amount of ethanol in it. Today we use, and I say we, I mean the world, I don't care, but we use alcohol concentration or alcohol by volume or ABV. Now, if you've heard the idea of proof, something proof, that is just twice the alcohol content. So a 40 proof is 20% alcohol or 20% ethanol. So the Bible, so did Bible figures, were they drinking things that were mildly alcoholic or really alcoholic? And I think for the most part we can see, well, there were some people that were drinking things that were alcoholic because they got drunk. And other times it's really hard to say if they were drinking alcoholic beverages or not because they were just drinking wine like anybody else would. So according to the National Institutes of Health, a 12-ounce beer is 5% alcohol. A 8 to 10 ounce of malt liquor is 7% ABV. 5 ounces of wine, today's wine is 12%. 3 to 4 ounces of fortified wine is 17%. 2 to 3 ounces of cordial is 24%. 1.5 ounces of brandy is 40% ABV. 1.5 ounces of distilled spirits, so that would be gin, rum, vodka, or whiskey, is 40%. And the more distilled you get, the more alcoholic content. So Absinthe is as much as 90% alcohol, and Everclear is as much as 95%. So thinking about then the Old Testament and the Old Testament alcohol, fermentation would only produce a certain percentage of alcoholic content. There's around 14 to 18%. 18% is really the tops, and the alcohol eats all the yeast and really is pretty toxic to the yeast. So natural fermentation, you can only get to about 18% ABV. So most Bible wine could really get to only about 5% ABV. So they didn't have the means to add the yeast, and sometimes they could add some leaven, but that's not the same thing as yeast. And so there's certain limitations to what people drank back then, and how they would go about doing that to make alcohol, because they just didn't have the technology that we have today. Today, to get really alcoholic beverages, you need distilling. This is a method that actually, interestingly, started with alchemy. People were trying to turn lead into gold, and in the process, found that you can make alcohol really, really potent by distilling it. And I don't understand all the ins and outs of it, but apparently you boil it until you get the vapor, and if you can capture that vapor in tubes, then that'll solidify, and that is the alcohol you can have. Well, they didn't know how to do that in Bible times, and so they weren't going to get ever something that was really, really alcoholic. They didn't know how to do any of that. Why does that matter? Well, because if you were going to get drunk in Bible times, with the technology you had to just drink a lot. There was no give me a shot and let me go on my way. You would have had to sit there and drink a lot of wine. And if you're drinking wine watered down, again, that could just be grape juice. Now, they may have fermented it to kill some of the bacteria. There are fermented drinks that have good bacteria, right? There's fermented drinks like kombucha. There's one, I remember seeing this, and this is like, I wish I could remember where it was so I could ask the Lord to never send me there. But it was some kind of tribe where what they would do is they would chew this corn in their mouth, and then they would spit it in this pot, this community pot. And then they would take another drink and they'd kind of let it sit in their mouth and they'd spit it back in. And that's the way it fermented. And that was a delicacy. And people coming in from the outside, they'd say, would you like some? And it was rude to say no, but I would lose my testimony over something like that. I'm not a germaphobe, but I'm not drinking other people's spit. I'm just saying. But that's the idea of this fermented drink, right? Every culture kind of has their drinks that are fermented, and it has a little bit of alcohol in it, but you got to drink a lot to get drunk or to start feeling the effects. Again, levels might matter and how much they drank, but what I'm saying, it was a very, you didn't get drunk by accident in Old Testament times because it just wasn't that easy to do. Okay, so was alcohol, at least in the Old Testament, strictly forbidden? I'm going to say no for 3 reasons. 1, no, because there's some alcohol in fermented juices. Grape juice has 0.29% ABV. So again, there is some alcohol in grape juice. You know what has more alcohol than grape juice? Wheat rolls. Like dinner rolls. Because the wheat has some kind of alcoholic content. Now, how many wheat rolls do you have to eat before you get really drunk? Someone's like, I don't know, but I'd love to find out. Well, all I'm saying is the Bible isn't saying absolutely no alcoholic content, because there's alcohol in lots of things, but there's such a small amount that you're not going to get drunk unless you start drinking or eating a lot of it. So no, it's not strictly forbidden. No, because number 2, its use was never forbidden in Scripture. The priests and Levites were to not drink it, but think about this. If they were forbidden to drink it, that means that everybody else was drinking it, right? Because God could have, he already said, again, don't eat bats and vultures. He could have just said, also no alcoholic beverage, no beverages with any alcohol in it at all. He said that for the priests, he said that for the Nazarites, but that again implies that everybody else was having something that had some alcoholic content in it. In fact, besides that, Deuteronomy 14:26 gives permission to drink wine and strong drink. Deuteronomy 14:26, and thou shalt bestow that money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after, for oxen, for sheep, or for wine, or for strong drink, or for whatsoever thy soul desireth, and thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine household. So there's permission to be able to have, it says wine, yayin, and strong drink, shakar. And now again, he doesn't say you can get drunk, but he says you're allowed to have these things. But drunkenness was still forbidden. So is alcohol strictly forbidden in the Old Testament? No, because 3, there were times it was needed medicinally. You're in Proverbs 10 or so. Go to Proverbs 31 or so. Proverbs 31, verse 6 says, give strong drink unto him that is ready to perish, and wine unto those that be of heavy hearts. Okay, it is good to give them some kind of medicinal, alcoholic help. So someone who's ready to die, what would something with stronger alcohol do for them? Well, it might dull the pain. It might help them to not be so anxious. It might help them to be able to relax a little bit. But again, I don't know how many of you have ever been with a hospice patient or been involved in that whole hospice process, but if you haven't ever been, then here's what they'll tell you. They'll say, well, we're just going to give comfort measures, and we have morphine available. And they tell you, now morphine will shorten their life. It will actually hasten the end, but it will keep them comfortable. All right, so if you come to the point where you're in hospice, understand the morphine will help you be free from pain, but it also kind of hastens your demise. Now, that's not the same thing as suicide. It's not the same thing as euthanasia. It's me taking the comfort measures, but with everything that you take, there's a trade-off, right? So if you take alcohol because you're ready to perish, there's a trade-off there. You get some comfort, you get maybe a little bit to relax, and you're not so, but it's also maybe going to hasten your life. It's going to not do good things for your body. And so he says here, give strong drink unto him that is ready to perish, and wine unto those that be of heavy hearts. To do something in the most extreme cases, you need to give them something to kind of lift them out from where they are. Now, again, we said this last week, but people don't use it in the extreme cases, do they? They use it for, I'm sad. My favorite show ended. They took it off of Netflix. Or, I had a hard day. My boss told me to work. I need a drink. I'm going to stop by the bar on the way home. And they use it as a coping mechanism all the time. Scripturally, what it's used for, especially, again, strong drink, was medicinally. Now, notice verse 4. It is not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes strong drink. Why? Verse 5. Lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. All right, we said this last week, but I'll just repeat it again. There are certain people that we're not supposed to drink. Any alcoholic content or whatever, anything that would even be close to giving them a buzz, that would be the priests and princes and kings. Why? Because it was important for them to maintain their judgment. People that are at the end of their life, they're not the kind of people that need judgment and to be able to make decisions. Other people are making decisions for them. So this is, again, the same thing for morphine. The other verse that, and again, it's a little bit controversial because some people, we'll talk about it next week, I guess, a little bit more, but 1 Timothy 5, verse 23, where Paul instructs Timothy, drink no longer water, but use a little wine for thy stomach's sake and thine often infirmities. Some people have argued that this was not alcoholic, it was just grape juice, and he's saying, put a little vitamin C in your diet. I tend to think that it was alcoholic in some way, but notice he says little. Don't just drink water, but put a little bit of wine in your water. Now, why? Was he killing the germs? Maybe. Was there some kind of antiseptic property to alcohol that would help him with his stomach? I don't know all of why, but Paul's like, it's okay, and I'm actually prescribing this for you to do this. Now again, why? Yeah. Timothy, the ministry is really hard. You better have something stashed away in your drawer. No, he's not saying that. He's saying, I heard you have stomach problems. You've been talking about this. Can I just advise putting a little bit of wine in your water for your stomach's sake, or just taking a little bit of wine? Again, not to feel the effects of drunkenness. So it's okay to have, for us, some acetaminophen, some cough syrup. Those things have alcohol in them, right? And I'm not going to be like, oh, no, I couldn't. No, if I drink a whole case of Dimetap, maybe that's a problem, you know? Maybe I've got some issues that I got to work through. But if it is for medicinal purposes, then I don't want to say, oh, no, we can never have anything that has any kind of alcoholic content, because many things do. Again, we go back to last week. The admonition is to stay away from drunkenness, to avoid drunkenness. And we also said last week that we don't always know where that line is, and any kind of effect on us could be problematic for us. Go back to Proverbs chapter 23, and I'll close up here. Proverbs 23, verse 29 says, who hath woe? Who hath sorrow? Who hath contentions? Who hath babbling? Who hath wounds without cause? Who hath redness of eyes? They that tarry long at the wine, they that go to seek mixed wine. Look not thou upon the wine when it is red, when it giveth his color in the cup, when it moveth itself aright. At the last it biteth like a serpent, it stingeth like an adder. Thine eyes shall behold strange women, and thine heart shall utter perverse things. Yea, thou shalt be as he that lieth down in the midst of the sea, or as he that lieth upon the top of a mast. They have stricken me, shalt thou say, and I was not sick. They have beaten me, and I felt it not. When shall I awake? I will seek it again. We talked a little bit about that last week, some of the addictive properties of alcohol. But notice verse number 31, where it says, look not thou on the wine when it is red, when it giveth his color. That is the idea of it starting to ferment, when it starts to change, when there starts to be movement. In fact, that's what the next phrase is, when it moveth itself aright, when there starts to be the bubbles forming in fermentation, when it starts to be alcoholic, when you're looking at it and it starts to move. He's saying that's not the kind of wine you should be drinking. On the spectrum of things, he's saying stay away from that alcoholic wine, staying away from that pure alcoholic wine. Again, if you're not careful, it will not help you feel better, but actually worse. In verse 34, yea, thou shalt be as he that lieth down in the midst of the sea, or as he that lieth upon the top of a mast. When studying this, again, we can't get away from the fact that people in the Old Testament drank wine. What we don't know is what was the alcoholic content of that wine. Some people got drunk, and that was absolutely wrong. But it's apparent that there was some alcoholic in some of the wine that they drank. And so I hate to kind of leave things just open like that. I'm going to give you next week reasons why I think it is the most wise and prudent to avoid alcohol altogether. But again, as much as I wanted to be able to say, oh, the Bible's pretty clear, don't ever, ever, ever have any kind of alcoholic content at all. I don't know that I can say that and be honest. However, next week, given some of the surrounding issues, I think I can confidently say that Christians have no business being even around alcohol. And so it's important for us to consider those things, Lord willing, next week. Now, last week I asked for some feedback on those sheets of paper, on the quizzes, and I got some. And I appreciate that. I will answer some of those things. But questions that you might have, or some suggestions that would help me kind of put this together, I would really appreciate that, to write those things down and to give them to me later. So that's what I have. Let's pray.